Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 16. There was one point which Anne, on returning to her family, would have been more thankful to ascertain even that Mr. Elliot being in love with Elizabeth, which was her father's not being in love with Mrs. Clay. She was very far from easy about it, and when she had been home a few hours, on going to the breakfast the next morning, she found that there had just been a decent pretence on the lady's side meaning to leave them. She could imagine that Mrs. Clay to have said, now Miss Anne was come, she would not suppose herself at all wanted, for Elizabeth was replying in a sort of whisper that that would not must not be any reason indeed. I assure you I feel none of it. She is nothing to me, compared with you, and she was in full time to hear her father say, "My dear ma'am, this not be, must not be. As yet you have seen nothing of Bath. You have been only to be useful. You must not run away from us now. You must stay acquainted Mrs. Wallace, the beautiful Mrs. Wallace, to your fine mind. I mu- I well know the sight of the beauty is real gratification." He spoke in look so much in earnest that Anne was not surprised to see Mrs. Clay stealing a glance at Elizabeth and herself. Her countenance, perhaps, might express some watchfulness, but the praise and the fine of mind did not appear to excite the thought in her sister. The lady could not but yield to joint entreaties, and promised to stay. In the course of the same morning, Anne and her father chancing to be alone together, he began to compliment her on her improved looks. He thought her less thin in her person, in her cheeks, her skin, her complexion, greatly improved, clearer, fresher. Had she been using anything in particular? No, nothing. Mary Gowland, he supposed. No, nothing at all. Ha! He was surprised at that, and added, "You certainly you cannot do better than to continue as you are. You cannot be better than well, or should I recommend Gowland, the constant use of Gowland during spring months. Mrs. Clay had been using it at my recommendation, and you see what it has done for her. You see how carried away her freckles." If Elizabeth hadn't but heard this, such personal praise might have struck her, as if she especially if she did not appear to Anne that the freckles were all at all lessened. But everything must take its chance. The evil of marriage would be much diminished if Elizabeth were also to marry. As for herself, she might always command a home with Lady Russell. Lady Russell's composed mind and polite manners were to put some trial on this point in her intercourse in Camden Place. The sight of Mrs. Clay in such favour and Anne so overlooked was perpetual provocation in her there, and it vexed her as much when she was away as the person in Bath who drinks water and gets all the new publications and a very large acquaintance, and was time to be vexed. As Mr. Elliot became known to her, she grew more charitable or more indifferent towards others. His manners were a immediate recommendation, and on conversing with him she found the solid so fully supporting the superficial, as she was at first, she told Anne, almost ready to exclaim, "Can this be Mr. Elliot?" and could not seriously picture herself as a more agreeable or estimable man. Everything united in him: good understanding, correct opinions, knowledge of the world, a warm heart. He had strong feelings of family attachment and any part of the world decorum. He was steady, observant, moderate, candid, which never ran away from the spirits by selfishness, which fancied itself strong feeling, and yet, with sensibility, not to be amiable and lovely. It was a value for all facilities of domestic life, in which characters fancied enthusiasm of violent agitation seldom really possess. She was sure that he had not been happy in marriage. Colonel Wallace said it, and Lady Russell saw it. It must have been no unhappiness to sour his mind, nor, she began pretty soon to suspect, to prevent his thinking of a second choice. Her satisfaction in Mr. Elliot outweighed all the plague of Mrs. Clay. It was somehow it was somehow in these years since Anne had begun to learn that she and her excellent friend could sometimes think differently, and it did not surprise her, therefore, that Lady Russell should see nothing suspicious or inconsistent, nothing to require more motives than appeared, in Mr. Elliot's great desire for a reconciliation. In Lady Russell's view, it was perfectly natural that Mr. Elliot, at the mature time of life, should feel it a most desirable object, and would very generally recommend him among all the sensible people to be on good terms with the head of his family. The simplest process in the worlds of time looked upon ahead naturally clear, and only erring in the heyday of youth, and presumed, however, still to smile about it. And at last to mention Elizabeth. Lady Russell listened and looked, and upon this only cautious reply, "Elizabeth! Very well. Time will explain." It was a reference to the future, which Anne, after a little observation, felt she must submit to. She could determine nothing at present, and in the house Elizabeth must be first, and she was the first in habit of such general conservance as Miss Elliot. She felt particularly that attention seemed to be almost impossible. Mr. Elliot, too, must be remembered that had not been a widower for 7 months. A little delay on his side might be very excusable, and in fact, Anne could never see the crepe around his hat, without fearing that she was the excusable one for attributing him to him in such imaginations, for the thought of his marriage had not been very happy. It had existed so many years that she could not comprehend the very rapid recovery from the awful expressions of it being dissolved. However, it might, he was without there any question that their pleasantest acquaintance in Bath. She saw nobody equal to him, and it was a great indulgence now and then to talk to him about Lyme. And when she seemed to have a lively wish to see again and be more of herself, they went through the particulars of their first meeting many great times. He gave her to understand that he had looked at her with some earnestness. She knew it well, and she remembered another person's to look also. They did not always like to think alike, and his value for rank in conjunction she perceived was greater than hers. It was not merely compliance, it must be a liking for the cause which made her enter warmly into her father and sister's solitudes on the subject, which she thought unworthy to excite him. The Bath paper one morning announced the arrival of the Dowager's Viscountess Dalrymple, and her daughter, the Honourable Miss Carteret, was all the comfort of no. Camden Place was swept away for many days, for the Dalrymples, in Anne's opinion most unfortunately, was the cousins of Elliot, in the agony of how to introduce themselves properly. Anne had never seen her father and sister before in contact with the nobility, and she must acknowledge herself disappointed. She had hoped better things for their high ideas for their own situation in life, and was reduced to the form of a wish which she had never foreseen, a wish that they had more pride for our cousins, Lady Dalrymple and Miss Carteret. Our cousins, the Dalrymples, sounded in her ears all day long. Sir Walter had been once in company with the late Viscount, and had never seen any of the rest of the family, and the difficulties in the case arose from there having been suspicion of all the intercourse by letters in the ceremony. And even since the death, the said late Viscount, when it was consequence for the dangerous illness of Sir Walter's at the same time, and there had been a unlucky omission at Kellynch. No letter of condolence had been sent to Ireland, and the neglect had been visited on the head of the sinner. When poor Lady Elliot died herself, no letter of condolence was received at Kellynch, and consequently there was but too much reason to apprehend that the Dalrymples considered their relationship closed. How to have this anxious business to set to rights must be admitted as the cousins again, and it was a question which, in a more rational manner, neither Lady Russell nor Mr. Elliot thought unimportant. Family connections were always worth preserving, had good company always worth seeing. Lady Dalrymple had taken a house for 3 months in Laura Place, and to be living in style. She had been in Bath for the year before, and Lady Russell had heard her spoken of as a charming woman. It was very desirable that the connection should be renewed, if it could be done, without any compromise of the propriety of the side of the Elliots. Sir Walter, however, would choose his own means, and wrote the last very fine letter of ample explanation, regret, entreaty to his right honourable cousin. Lady Russell nor Mr. Elliot could admire the letter. All it did was that it wanted, in bringing 3 lines of scrawl to Dowager Viscountess. She was very much honoured, and should be happy in their acquaintance. The toils of business were over, and the sweets began. They visited Laura Place, and had placed the cards of Dowager Viscountess Dalrymple and the Honourable Miss Claret to be arranged when they might be most visible. And our cousins in Laura Place, our cousins Lady Dalrymple and Miss Cardet, were talked of to everybody. Anne was ashamed. Had Lady Dalrymple and her daughter had been even very agreeable, she would have still been ashamed of the agitation they created. They were still but they were nothing. They were no superiority of the manner, accomplishment, or understanding. Lady Dalrymple had acquired the name of a charming woman because she had smiled in civil answer of everybody. Miss Cardet was still less to say, was so plain, awkward, and would have never tolerated in Camden Place but for her birth. Lady Russell had confessed she had expected something better, and yet it was an acquaintance worth having. When Anne ventured to speak in her opinion of them to Mr. Elliot, he agreed of there being nothing in themselves, but still maintained that, as a family connection, as good company as those who would collect good company around them, they had their value. Anne smiled and said, "My idea of good company, Mr. Elliot, is a company of clever, well-informed people, who have a great deal of conversation, and that's what I call good company." "You are mistaken," he said generally. "That is not good company. That is the best. Good company only requires birth, education, and manners, but the regard of education is not very nice. Birth and good manners are essential, but a little learning is by no means a dangerous thing in good company. On the contrary, it'll do very well. My cousin Anne shakes her head. She is not satisfied. She is fatuous. My dear cousin," sitting down by her, "you have a better right to be fatuous than almost any other woman I know. But will it answer? Will it make you happy? Will it not be wiser to accept the society of those good ladies in Laura Place, and enjoy all the advantages of the connection as far as possible? You may depend on it, and they will move in the first set of Bath this winter. As rank, and you being known to relate to them is having use in your fixing your family, our family, let me say, in that degree of consideration which we all must wish for. Yes, and we shall, indeed, be known to relating to them, and recollecting herself, and did not wishing to be answered. She added, I should certainly not there has been by far too much trouble to be taken procure the acquaintance, I suppose, smiling. I have no more pride than any of you, and I confess it does vex me, that we should be so solicitous to have the relationship acknowledged, and we may be very sure it is a matter of perfect indifference to them. Pardon me, sir, dear cousin, you are unjust in your own claims. In London, perhaps, you are present of quiet style of living, as you might say, but in Bath, Sir Walter Elliot and his family will always be worth knowing. Always acceptable as an acquaintance, said. Well, said Anne, I am certainly proud, too proud to enjoy a welcome which depends so entirely upon place. I love your indignation, he said, and it is very natural, and but you are here in Bath, and the object is to be established here with all the pregnant indignity which ought to belong to Sir Walter Elliot. You talk of being proud. I am called very proud, but I shall not wish to see myself otherwise, for our pride, if investigated, would have the same object. I would no doubt, and the kind may seem a little different. In one point, I'm sure, my dear cousin, he continued, speaking lower, though there was no one else in the room. In one point I am sure we must feel alike. We must feel that every addition in your father's society, among his equals or superior, that may be in use diverting his thoughts from those who are beneath him. He looked, as he spoke, to the seat which Mrs. Clay had been lately occupying, a sufficient explanation of what he particularly meant, and though Anne could not believe in their having the same sort of pride, she was pleased with him for not liking Mrs. Clay, and her conscience admitted that his wishing to promote her father's getting great acquaintance was more than excusable in the view of defeating her.